Well, we're in the middle of a Jonah series, and we decided for this intergenerational to step out of that series for a week, but we chose this particular parable intentionally because there's actually a lot of parallels between the Jonah story and the parable of the prodigal son. One writer has even called Jonah the prodigal prophet because in many ways he embodies both the younger and the older brother. Like the younger brother, he runs away and it leads him into a desperate place. Like the older brother, he struggles to have mercy on his enemies. And I just wonder if we ought to enter this story from both angles as well. I suspect that we can connect with the story on a couple of levels. And perhaps some of us come today, and as we hear this story, we find ourselves connecting with the younger brother today. And so the younger brother has disowned his father, he's squandered his wealth, and he's made some poor choices, and he ends up in a place of desperation. Now, this is partially the result of his choices. His choices are catching up to him. He's starting to face the consequences. But he also is dealing with issues outside of his control. A famine sets in on the land, and he is in a place of destitution. And so we have this picture of a man who is disconnected from God and is in a desperate place. And I just wonder this morning if at one level or another, we can connect with that experience. And I just wonder if some of us come today and we're feeling a sense of desperation. Now, some of us may be experiencing that because of circumstances outside of our control. Maybe you come today and you're navigating a season of grief or loss, a medical crisis, and it's feeling pretty overwhelming for you. Perhaps others of us can connect with the younger son, and we are dealing with some regret from some of the choices that we've made. Like the younger son, sometimes we have these moments where we realize that the things in this world that promise freedom and joy end up leading us into enslavement, addiction, pain. And perhaps some of us come today and we're just feeling a bit weighed down by some of those choices, feeling a bit stuck because of them. And maybe others of us, our story is less dramatic than the younger son, and yet just over time as we've got caught up with the cares of this world, we find ourselves in a place where we are distant or disconnected from the Lord. So I'm not sure what your story is, what you bring with you today, but I think at one level, a lot of us can enter into the story from the place of the younger son. We come with a certain amount of desperation and need. And if that is where you come today, I just want to speak a word of hope into those places. Because what we discover in this parable is that while the younger son begins in a place of desperation, that is not the end of his story. In fact, we see that this is an important part of his story, and this place of desperation becomes a catalyst, a turning point towards healing and growth. Mother Teresa has a really helpful reflection about the redemptive possibilities that come when we have the courage to acknowledge that we are stuck, or when we acknowledge that we are vulnerable or broken or need help. And she writes this: if we undertake this task, and she's talking about this task of confession or acknowledging our need before God, if we undertake this task with greater faithfulness, perhaps we will realize that what we sometimes consider a stumbling block is rather a rock we can step on. I wonder if we might reframe some of our experiences of failure and desperation and see them not as the end of our story, as a block towards growth, but instead as this stepping stone towards growth and towards healing. I wonder if we might reframe these opportunities as possibilities where God might be doing some really important work in our life. For you see, what happens when we come to the end of ourselves, I think there's actually room for God to enter into our life. When we give up the illusion that we've got it all together, there's room for us to call out for help. And that is why God says, very surprisingly, why Jesus says, "Blessed are those who are poor in spirit." Blessed are those of you who have come to the end of yourself, are in a place of desperation, in a place of brokenness. Why? Because yours is the kingdom of God. What this means is that when we come to the end of ourselves, we're kind of knocked off the throne of our lives, thinking that we are in control, that we are the king or queen of our kingdom, and instead there's room for God to move in and lead and guide us. And so I just hold out that hope to you that perhaps as we're hitting stumbling blocks, as we're hitting dead ends, could we see the possibility that God might want to help us step into a season of healing and growth. And that is indeed where the story leads. And we notice that as the younger son humbles himself and turns towards home, he encounters the lavish, extravagant grace of God. I just picture him walking home and he's reciting this confession, "Father, I've sinned. I'm not worthy to even be your son. Would you please forgive me?" And he's wondering how God will respond. And as he's halfway there, he encounters a God who sees him from afar and runs towards him. And so we read in verse 20, "But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him." Notice all these beautiful verbs that are ascribed to God. Right? He sees him with longing and compassion. He runs towards him, embraces him. As I was reading the story and reflecting on it again, I just noticed this picture of the father running. And I noticed this in one of the commentaries I was reading from Craig Keener. He says, it was a breach of an elderly Jewish man's dignity to run. And giving the normal garb, the father would have to pull up his skirt to run. And it just gives us this picture of a dignified man who just runs with abandon. He doesn't care about convention. He doesn't care what he looks like. He doesn't care that he looks silly. He's pulling up his skirt. He's running as fast as he can, maybe tripping, because he so longs to get close to his son. It's this beautiful picture of a God who looks upon us with love and is ready to receive us in grace and mercy. This parable is often called the parable of the prodigal son. That word prodigal means lavish and extravagant spending, and indeed that's what the prodigal son does, really. He just squanders his wealth. But some commentators suggest we ought to call this parable the parable of the prodigal God, because God in his own ways lavishes an extravagant amount of grace and mercy upon us, even when we have not earned it or when we do not deserve it. And so I wonder if this picture of God that Jesus describes in this parable might bring some correctives to our picture or image of God. How do you think God feels about you? I encourage you to just pause and think about that for a minute. As you just picture God looking upon you, what picture do you see? What does his face look like? How do you think God feels about you when God looks upon you? As I've had the chance to walk with a number of people along the spiritual path, as I've walked it myself now, I've come to discover that a lot of us, when we answer that question honestly, think that God is primarily angry and disappointed with us. And the picture that comes to many of our minds when we imagine God looking upon us is a God looking at us with stern and disappointing eyes. And what this parable teaches us is that assumption is incorrect. That assumption is incorrect. That instead we have a God who looks upon us with great mercy and great grace and great love. Vagrius Ponticus is a monk who lived in the desert in the 4th century. I may have shared this before, but he says that one of the strategies of the evil one is to make us feel too uncomfortable to return to God, to just be stuck in our regret and in our shame and feel like we're not good enough and that we can't turn back to God because God will reject us. And maybe that's some of your experience. Maybe some of you come today, you feel maybe too far gone from God. You feel just overwhelmed, ashamed, uncomfortable in this place. And this parable just breaks through all that, and it gives us a new picture of a God who looks upon us with grace and is ready to receive us and lavish, extravagant mercy upon us today. So the Jesuit writer Anthony de Mello loved this prayer practice. He says, we ought to imagine God looking upon us and smiling. Imagine God looking upon you and smiling. You might even consider doing that for a few minutes this week to begin to heal this distorted image that we've picked up somewhere along the way, that God looks at us with disappointment and anger. This parable gives us a beautiful new picture of God. And so perhaps it is good for us to read ourselves into the story again from the lens of the parable, from the lens of the younger son. That news never gets old, right? We need to hear that time and time again. But I suspect that we can also read ourselves into this story from the vantage point of the older son as well. The older son is scandalized by grace, and I can empathize with that. He's been a good boy. He's kept the rules. He's honored his father. He's put in his time. And when he sees his father lavish this grace on his brother who's made all these mistakes and has dishonored his father and squandered his wealth, he is angry. He is angry at his father's mercy. And as the story comes to an end, we see that in his own way, the older brother is also disconnected from God. You know, there are two extremes and two ways by which we can run from God or be disconnected from God. We can become really, really bad and break all the rules, or we can become really, really good and keep all the rules, but become a bit self-righteous and proud along the way, which is the people he's speaking to in this parable, the Pharisees. Both extremes cut us off from relationship and reliance on God. So we see this older brother cultivate a bitterness that cuts him off from his family. Notice how he talks about his brother. It's no longer his brother, it's that son of yours. And I think that happens when we have disrupted relationships. We begin to dehumanize the person that has let us down or hurt us. It's no longer a brother or sister in the Lord, but that person over there, that group over there. And as that bitterness grows and festers, he is now outside the celebration, missing out on the joy, the possibility of reconciliation. In the classic book Boundaries by Henry Cloud and John Townsend, they use this metaphor that says, sometimes if we allow a grudge to fester, it's like drinking poison and hoping the other person dies. Now, I want to tread carefully here because I recognize that when we have been hurt, it is a process, and sometimes there is righteous anger at injustice. And yet the gospel calls us to work through that and move past the place where that bitterness begins to fester and grow such that it actually eats away at us and at our joy and our capacity to live with freedom. And part of the invitation in this parable is for us to reflect on those people that have let us down, that have hurt us, that God is inviting us to move towards, to take steps towards forgiveness and grace. Now, this is a process, and I appreciate how Henry Cloud and John Townsend go on to just talk about the dynamics of reconciliation. I've maybe shared this before, but I've really just found their teaching helpful, that they talk about the distinctions between forgiveness, reconciliation, and trust. And so forgiveness is about the past, and then it's a call to let go of those things that can no longer be changed, to let go of those things that are weighing on us, even for our own sake. Reconciliation, then, is about the present, and that really requires two people to come together. And we see in this scene the younger son taking steps towards reconciliation. He's owning his mistakes. He's humble. He's wanting to engage in that process. And sometimes we long for that, and those opportunities aren't open, as it's just the other person doesn't want to engage in that. But we can take the steps we can take. Trust is about the future, and I think it's just helpful that when there's been cycles of pain and abuse and hurt, sometimes that has to be rebuilt, and to say I forgive doesn't always mean I trust, right? There can be a process there. But what this parable does teach and does call us to is to take those steps towards this call to reconciliation, to lay down that burden of bitterness, and to enter ultimately into God's love for our enemies, to take the steps we can to be part of the ministry of reconciliation that we have been called to. And so I just wonder, as we enter the story from this angle, if there is someone God has placed on your heart that he wants you to forgive, to work through and move on that long journey often, but that hard journey, important journey of reconciliation. You know, I often like to end a sermon with a contemporary story that just brings us home, brings it into our world. But today, I want you to be the conclusion to the sermon. I want to leave room for us to enter into the story and reflect on the way God wants to do some healing in our heart, whether that is as the younger son or daughter needs to, again, hear this great news of God's grace and mercy, or as we come in as the older son and allow God to begin to soften our hearts, be part of this work of reconciliation. And so today, as the kids do in their time, we're going to enter into their world a little bit. We're going to have some extended time for response. And I'm just going to explain just some options for you as you come into this response time. We're going to have a few minutes of just silent reflection, and there's going to be just some background music. And during that time, there's some different options for you. You might just sit in silence and listen. In your bulletin, there's this beautiful sculpture called Reconciliation that lives at Duke Divinity School, and it depicts in a powerful way this story that we've told. And it may be helpful in those few minutes just to practice what's called Visio Divina. It's where you meditate on an image. And there's some steps on the back that can kind of walk you through this process, kind of like Lectio Divina, to just sit with this image, see what you're drawn to, see what's rising to the surface, enter into prayer with God through this image. There's also some stations if you would like to be creative, and kids, in a moment, you'll be invited to come up and you can get some art supplies. There's also some at the back for those who don't maybe want to come all the way forward or sitting at the back out in the foyer. You can grab some art supplies, or you can just sit. But I want to invite us now to enter into the story and respond and to be open to the way that the Spirit of God might want to do some healing work. That's been my prayer for us this week, that God would be doing some healing, restoring, reconciling work in our hearts today. Can we come with those expectant hearts?